Wonderful. Thanks, Steph. I really appreciate it. All right, guys, I hope you are ready to get started and learn how to use Tableau. I'm seeing some familiar faces from our prior meet and greet, so it's really good to see all of you today. The goal of this session is very much to be hands-on, so I encourage you, if you haven't already, download Tableau Public or Tableau Desktops and follow along with us. That's the intention behind it. To start, we are going to be working with this file here, the Urban Park Ranger Animal Condition Response, and we've also got a nice data dictionary. I'm currently based out of Phoenix, Arizona, but I'll be moving to New York City shortly, so it's actually been really fun to take this opportunity to learn about New York data, and New York actually has a wealth of information. We source this data from NYC Open Data. So if you're struggling for a data set, for your application, this could be a good place to get started. They've got a lot of really clean data, a lot of interesting data to work with. And certainly, I think you'll see that as we go throughout our training today. As Steph mentioned, I encourage you, if you have questions or you get stuck along the way, say something in chat. We've got a lot of team members here today. So ideally, if you get stuck in a one-off moment, we'll kind of go to the side and work with you to get that resolved. If there's any bigger, broader issues, the team's going to kind of share that with me. I tend to get very enthusiastic and talk fast when we're talking about data, which is one of the reasons I love my job. Hopefully one of the reasons you'll join us in New York. So please do feel free to say slow down, encourage me to take a breath or a sip of water as we go throughout the training. But with that, let's just dive into the data. It's very important, I think, when we start analyzing any data set to ask ourselves, what is this data? What does it represent? So I'm actually going to bring these both up for you, and I encourage you to do the same. So the data set we're working with today, you can see the rows of data here, and one row of data represents someone making a phone call or a text. New York City has a 311 phone number. It's a non-emergency response line. And so the purpose of this and the data that is being recorded is people spot animals mostly in parks and they shouldn't be there, or maybe they're injured or something's going on. And so the urban park rangers are dispatched. Once they're dispatched, they gather some information about that particular animal, which you will see as we start building this out. But this data set does come with a data dictionary, so we can kind of see what it represents, which I think I've kind of explained pretty well. It has column information. These are important things anytime you're working with an unfamiliar data set to work with. So in particular for today, we'll be working with some dates and some times that you can see when the initial call was, when the ranger responded. There's information about where this event took place. Again, it's mostly in parks. You'll see some of that whenever I pull up the data in Tableau. And then there's some fun information about the actual type of animals, and we'll have some fun sort of investigating the data along the way and looking at some of the spikes that show up throughout and kind of categorizing and kind of making sense of the data that we've got in there. Another important metric I'll show you, and then we'll just kind of dive into Tableau and actually get connected, is the number of animals. So for each phone call, if you can imagine, it's got the number of animals that were part of that response. So let's say there was a small group of cats, as an example. I don't know why you'd have a gang of cats, but maybe there's a gang of cats in a New York park. You'd see the number of cats or animals represented in that phone call as well. So again, this is what our data set looks like. Not much we can do with it in an Excel fashion. This is just what it looks like. So I'm going to just dive directly into Tableau. I'm going to go ahead and close that file because we're going to work directly in Tableau from here on out. So if it's your first time actually opening Tableau, I always like to start here because this gives you good insight into how the tool functions. Anytime you start working in Tableau, you're going to head to this page. So in the middle here, you're going to see all of my recent workbooks that I've built visualizations for. I actually built a viz that's on my Tableau Public when I was doing apartment hunting in New York City to try to find a place, and it worked out very well. My partner loves to eat Chipotle, so that had to be close. So you'll see a couple of strategic Chipotles on that map if you go look at it. But in the middle, you're seeing anything that you've previously worked on, your recent files. On the right side, you're going to see how you can get started using Tableau. These are curated by Tableau itself. They might be a little bit different if you're using Tableau Public, but you can see there are getting started videos, how to connect to data. There's a lot of really short video tutorials that Tableau puts out itself so that you can get connected with the tool. And then similarly, there are some resources, more like blog posts or knowledge articles. But the fun part of this is actually connecting to the data. I'm using the full version of Tableau Desktop, so I can see lots of different data types and things that I can connect to. We'll be connecting to Microsoft Excel today. Again, if you're using Tableau Public, you're going to have a shorter list. If you're working on the full version of Tableau Desktop, here is just a small taste of all the data sources that we can connect to. I like to say, as I get started working with Tableau and I'm teaching people about it, that Tableau is a data reader. So what we do is we point Tableau at our data, it reads on top of it, and then we sort of transform and visualize on top of that, which is really cool and different than a lot of traditional analysis that might be done in Excel or Google Sheets or more manually, maybe in like a PowerPoint. So with that, we're going to connect to our first data set. So you're going to go ahead and you'll click on Microsoft Excel. I'm going to click the data set and I'm going to go ahead and open it. Now, when you open your data set for the first time, a couple things are going to happen. First, you're going to see the data connection over on the left. So this is the file that we actually connected to. This is the table or worksheet, really the sheet in the Excel workbook that we've connected to. But we've got two really nice things going on in that middle section. On the right, we're seeing a preview of that data. So this matches exactly what I showed you in Excel. We're seeing those first 100 rows. And then I also like this view on the left, which has sort of metadata or column information. So this is sort of that kind of summarized view. It's not a true data dictionary because we haven't described what those fields represent, but you can see all of the columns or fields of data that we will be working with. This is good. Usually when I'm working with Tableau and working with a data set, I'll pause here and just kind of look through, see if all the data kind of imported or was read correctly, so to speak, and then start diving in to do some analysis. I'm going to go ahead and head over to sheet 1, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the UI, how the application itself is laid out. So we connected to our file. We can see the fields, the columns that are coming through. Tableau makes it very easy for us to work with data. You'll see first all of those field names listed over on the left side, and then you'll see this horizontal line here between. In the world of Tableau, there's this idea of dimensions and measures. Dimensions are things that typically are generating headers for your data, which I will show you and we will build. And measures are things you typically do math on. So you're summing something up, you're taking an average, you're counting something. That's sort of the big breakdown between dimensions and measures. It gets a little bit more murky along the way, particularly when we're working with dates, which I will show you in terms of how Tableau functions. But at a high level, it's important to just see, here's all the fields that I can work with and to analyze with, and then you can see a breakdown of which ones are dimensions and which ones are measures. Important things about this section, and one of the reasons I actually love working with Tableau is, for example, this date and time of initial call, and it might actually benefit us to go back to the data preview section. We can see that it's a date with a timestamp, but Tableau has imported it or read it in as a text or a string. It's really easy for us to click on that data type icon right here and change it. So I can change it to a date and time. This is actually one of the best things about Tableau. It's got a lot of auto magic. It has built into the application 100+ different ways to read and interpret dates and times so that they can be in a date time format. So one of the things I was looking at when I first saw this data set is there's actually two styles for the date. You can see this one doesn't have AM or PM on it, and this is why I think Tableau read it in as a string, but that's not a problem. We can change it to a date, and it actually picks up both of those formats of time throughout, and we've got nice clean dates there. We can do the same thing over in our data pane or our data source section as well. So you can go ahead and switch this over to date and time. And that goes for any fields that you've got. And this is where, again, I try to remind people that Tableau is a data reader. So we're not changing the underlying data, we're changing how Tableau is interpreting it, and we're changing how we actually get to work with that data. If we had other things, for example, that needed to be a measure instead of a dimension, we could certainly work with that as well. But for now, I think to start, we'll just change the date and time of the initial call to a date time, and the same thing with the date and time of the ranger response. Now, before I move on further, I'm going to do one more thing, which you do not have to do, which is I'm going to just make everything a little bit bolder and bigger for the sake of the presentation. I'm going to make all my fonts just a bit larger so it'll be easier for you guys to read as we go along. Again, not required. We're going to try to build a dashboard in the 40-ish minutes I've got left here, so we'll be going fast, and you'll have time at the end to do additional formatting. So the first thing to say about starting to work with data in Tableau, the next thing to say is that Tableau functions with sheets. So each new tab you create is a sheet or a worksheet. A sheet is a place to build a single visualization, and then a dashboard, which is this 4-square icon, is where you put a collection of sheets. So throughout this training, when we get to the end, we're going to be building up some visualizations along the way. You'll be getting hands-on with how to use some of the Tableau UI, and then we'll be building ourselves up to an interactive dashboard that hopefully communicates what's going on and what type of animals are actually in the New York City parks, and what people are responding to. So working with Tableau Desktops, really easy. We can start by dragging and dropping data into the canvas or the area, the pane area. I do want to call out that there is this nice sort of show me menu that is available. If this is the first time that you've ever opened Tableau, you're probably seeing that. You can click on this in the upper left to just tuck that away. It's handy whenever you get to know Tableau. It'll tell you how to make visualizations, but I find the best way to teach and learn is actually to drag and drop things where they should kind of line up along the way. And then the other thing, because this happens to people sometimes, so I don't want you to get caught, is if you move this over, there is a way that you can kind of like hide this, and you can also close it. So if you do close it, there's a section down at the bottom if you need to bring it back up again if you can't access your data. But with that, let's just start playing around with this data. Like I mentioned, we're looking at the number of animals. I'm just going to drag the number of animals on, and let's even make this a lot bigger so we can see this. I'm going to format this, so bring it over here. So this data set, and maybe it's also important to actually go to, let me just go ahead and make this the number of animals. And what I'm doing here is dragging on the number of animals down here, which is a field that's in our data set. You'll notice when it's dragged on, I dragged it onto what's called the text shelf. This is the marks card. All of these are different shelves. These are ways to interact with your data. We can see the different mark types. So these are the different visualization types that we can start to work with. But you'll see when I drag that onto text, that it is automatically aggregating to the sum of the number of animals. So it would be appropriate to say that this data set spans or has a report for 3,796 animals that have been reported to the New York City Urban Park Rangers. But maybe more important than that, let me just rename this for now, and let's call this the number of animals, is getting to know more about how many calls are in the data itself. So I'm just going to click and build another sheet. Again, you can click this plus icon here if you want. And I want to now count the number of calls. This is why it's important to know your data really well. There's not a measure in here. There's not a field in here that has the number of calls. But as I told you, a call is one row of data. So we can make our first calculated field. There's lots of different ways to make calculated fields. I typically say you can right click anywhere if you're on a PC to do most tasks. You can also click on this drop down to create a calculated field. So we're going to create our first calculated field. And let me make this just a little bit smaller. This will be our first foray into the calculation editor. We won't spend a lot of time here during this session, but trust me when I say whenever we get into real training at the data school, we'll be spending lots of time creating calculations. But for now, if you're following along, we're just going to call this number of calls. And I'm just going to put a 1 in here. That's all that it's going to be. The purpose of this, and if you're familiar with Tableau, you've used Tableau for a longer period of time, this is similar to a calculated field that used to be in there called the number of records, which was also just 1. So all this is for every row of data, we're going to add a 1 here so that when we look at our data, and I'm clicking on this preview icon, we should see now the number of calls 1. So this will allow us to aggregate up that number of calls. This will be good for us to kind of get a sense of how long we've actually had this data, how many years are we talking about, what is the time frame associated with it. And that's actually a good way I start any analysis that I'm working with, looking at the dates, because that gives us some, a concept of time, and we get a good sense of how much data we're working with. So I'm going to drag number of calls onto text very similarly to what we did with the number of animals. So get 2,609 calls, or maybe more appropriately, we could make it a bar chart. So again, 2,609 calls. Now this is where it gets fun. We can bring on time. I'm just going to double click on the date and time of the initial call. I'm going to set this to entire view so you guys get a better sense of what's going on. So just by double clicking in Tableau, I now have time trended by year. So we can see that we probably have about 4 years of data starting in 2018, going up through 2021. One of the things that's really cool about Tableau is you can drill into date parts or dates in general in many different ways. So I'm clicking on this plus icon down here, and this is something you can do for users when you are building a dashboard for them. And you can start drilling into those different time components. If you are watching the top, so this is the column shelf and the row shelf, you're seeing that the column shelf is adding some automatic fields associated with time to our visualization. And that's really cool because we can drill in further, but we can also play around with how this looks. So as an example, if I don't want quarter in the view, I can take it out. So now we've got each month. We can see each year, so we can now more confidently say that we've got data from January 2018 up through December 2021, and we're getting some sense of how many calls are happening over time. Is there some seasonality as to when people are seeing animals, that type of thing. And we can even do things like swap it. So now we can see, okay, comparing January year over year, are the trend of calls going up? Or we can even do something like this where we drag it onto color. Now we have all 4 years together and we can sort of compare them. So there's certainly some interesting spike in July 2018 we might want to look at. And I think we'll do the same thing for the animals as well, because there's some fun insights to uncover. For now, let's go ahead and just rename this, and let's just call this calls by month to begin with. I'm going to show you a couple more visualizations as we build, but we'll just kind of keep this. I'd say we're sort of in an exploratory phase to understand the data that we have. So now we get a good sense of by month, by year, how many calls are we actually talking about? So it ranges in that sort of like 45 to 70 range. And there's obviously some very interesting spike in 2018 we might want to go look at. Let's do the same thing if you're tracking with me, and we're going to do animals by month. This time we're going to be a little bit more efficient with how we're moving things onto the canvas, and this is a good way to explain how dates work in Tableau in a little bit more detail. I'm going to now right click and drag my date and time of initial call onto the column shelf. Now, at first glance, this menu seems a bit overwhelming. There are a lot of options, but this is one of the best menus you can actually have in Tableau. If we break this down, you'll notice now that there are 2 colors on my screen next to the different date types. There are the blue and there are the green. Blue fields in Tableau, which are typically dimensions, but not always. Dates and times being a good example of one that kind of leads both ways. But discrete dimensions, so blue being discrete, meaning think of like a list. It's categories of things. And then continuous being green, things typically measures, but not always. You can see we've got continuous date times here. Continuous fields in Tableau build unbroken axes would be the way to say it. So think of an infinite number line or an infinite timeline. So when we do this visualization, instead of working with the discrete date parts, we're going to now work with the continuous ones. And what we're going to end up with as I do this, so if you're tracking with me, let's go ahead and click on month here. You can see we've got this sort of axis of time that has tick marks. So it has a tick mark for November 2017, but there's no data there. But we can kind of see where those major tick marks are that Tableau has drawn for us. But this gives you a better sense of this sort of unbroken, continuous, infinite axis of time. And now let's drag on the number of animals to rows. Tableau is smart enough to change the visualization mark type. So you'll notice if I go back a step, and important to say, Tableau has infinite undo, so it's kind of nice, and infinite redo. And there's also autosave that happens along the way. So one of the fun parts about working with Tableau, especially if you're analyzing data and you're building something to understand your data in more detail, is take advantage of the infinite undo and certainly pivot from what you're making if it doesn't really go down a path of analysis that takes you anywhere. But for now, this is good. I wanted to show this that right now the automatic mark type is a Gantt bar, so that's why it's drawing these vertical lines. I could change that to a line. And as you get more comfortable working with Tableau, I will highly encourage you not to put it on automatic and to choose the mark type as you get started. So we'll drag the number of animals back on. I want to kind of pause for a second and kind of query the chat. And I'm going to load it up here. Anything you guys see sticking out in this data? So this is, again, the number of calls by month into the urban rangers. Anything we want to kind of inquire about, look into a bit further here? Reindeers in Central Park on Christmas days. Yes, the 950, this is animals. Yes, Eric, this is animals, but you're right. The spike in January 2020, something happened here. And I think it benefits us to check it out and to use Tableau to do that. So 2 ways to go about this. First is we can just click on this mark. The dot is called a mark. And we can click on this view data. We're seeing the summary of that 949 animals, but if we go to full data, we're going to see all of the 58 rows that make up that data. And you can sort inside of here if you want. Let's go over to the number of animals and let's see what we got. Okay, so let's see what day this was. On January 7th, 2020, someone called in and found a bunch of fish. So someone called in and maybe they counted them. I'm not sure. 900 seems like a pretty even number, but 900 Atlantic Menhaden fish were found and called in. I actually Googled what this fish looks like. It's an unremarkable river fish, or maybe it says Atlantic, so maybe it's an ocean fish. It's a silver fish, looks like like a sea bass or something like that. But anyway, clearly this is some sort of anomaly where somebody called in a bunch of fish, and we'll kind of want to work through that. And this brings me to kind of the good next step of maybe where we want to go, which is, okay, so there's a spike in our data right here. We see that that has to do with fish. Let's actually see what type of animals are in the data set. I'm going to bring on the animal class. If we look at our data, and I'm going to make this the entire view, we actually have a couple different categories of how we classify the animals. This one's probably the cleanest. You saw me look, and I'm going to right click on the species description and describe, because we'll get a small list of those. This is almost species specific, so you can imagine how many results we might have with this. If we bring on the number of animals here, so I'm going to now build a bar chart. Again, I have my blue discrete dimension, my animal class here, it's making a header, and I've got my number of animals on columns. Let's go ahead and sort this. You can sort 2 ways down here at the bottom right on the visualization itself. You can click that. There's the same icon right here as well. So default Tableau will do this in alphabetical order. But this is kind of hard on the eyes. We can't really compare things. So the first thing we might want to do is to sort our data. I'm going to go ahead and add a label here so we get a good sense. So the fish numerous quantity is at the top.
we had 900 of those Atlantic fish, and so there must be 95 other fish numerous quantity. And then we've got a large grouping of birds, and it kind of goes down from there. As I was looking at this for the first time in preparation, I was looking at what does RVS stand for. So I will pause and go to an aside to show you that RVS actually relates to rabies. So there are some animals that are higher carriers of rabies, which certainly matters for domestic animals and for humans alike. So some of them are classified as RVS species and some are not. But I still think we probably need to clean up this data a little bit further. This is going to be a lot of noise. You can see we've got a couple things like birds and then this domestic that we might want to group together and kind of consolidate so it's easier for our audience to understand the data. So what we're going to do now is we're going to build our first group in Tableau. So to build a group is actually really easy. Again, there's many different ways. If we're going to start by just grouping together birds and raptors. So raptors are also birds. Owls are considered raptors. I'm thinking that raptors means predatorial birds. So let's try and grab all of the bird related names here, and let's start with grouping those together. I'm holding down my control key. I know you can't see it, but I'm holding down my control key to select those particular animal classes. Now, when I do this, you'll see that we've got this toolbar that comes up, and this paperclip icon is what we're going to click on. This allows us to group these dimensions into their categories. You'll see on the left, so let me undo and redo, focus here on this left side, that we now have this animal class group. And birds with this domestic hashtag after it, and raptors are all grouped in one. And we've got this field that automatically generated. It's got the paperclip icon on here as well. I'm going to go ahead and right click and edit this group so you can see what this looks like. And we're going to work in here for the rest of our grouping exercise. First, let's give it a better name. Let's just call it animal type to make it a little bit more clean. And we're going to end up with 4 groups. I've kind of preset these. We can certainly, when you're playing on your own, or if you want to take this data set away and do anything else with it, you're certainly welcome to classify things however you want. But for the sake of this, we're going to classify it into 4 groups. The first one is birds, and I'm looking off screen to make sure I captured all of them. Birds, domestic birds. Oh, there's a domestic hashtag birds, which we can just drag up into that grouping. And you'll see it added in there. And we'll also rename this. So let's just call this birds. This is just our general birds bucket. Let's do our marine life. So let's put all those fish and then even the terrestrial reptiles and amphibians as well. Let's grab anything that's sort of marine and put it together. Our 4 categories are going to be birds, marine life / amphibians, domestic animals, so cats, dogs, rabbits, guinea pigs, and then non-domestic mammals or animals. So coyote and deer. So let's put fish, the fish numerous. Again, I'm holding down my control key, the marine mammals, all of those, the reptiles, the non-native fish, the terrestrial reptiles. Let's group all of those together and let's call this marine life. Now let's grab the domestic animals. So let's grab both domestic, let's grab small mammals that are also domestic, and let's grab this one as well. And let's just call this domestic animals. And then for our last grouping, we can do this 2 ways. We can either tick this box and construct an other, which means as we get new data or new categories or animal classes, they'll automatically dump into that group. So we have that other, or we can just manually do that. So if I untick that box other, we now see those again. And I'm going to just take coyotes, deer, so rare endangered, and all the remaining small animals. And let's just call this non-domestic mammals to begin with. Now I'm going to click the apply button. And this is a little bit easier to read. We're going to go ahead and resort it. So now we have just 4 buckets of animals instead of sort of that noise of maybe 16 or 20 categories, some of which were redundant, and we can use this inside of our analysis. So now if we go back to our number of animals visualization, we can take animal type and we can bring it onto color. So now you can imagine if you are working with your data and someone comes along and says, okay, what exactly is that spike that happened in January? We can more clearly say it's related to marine life. And it might even be appropriate to filter those out at some point. If you're looking, because I was very interested in this data point, this 200, it kind of stuck out to me as well, because it was a little bit different. There's only 4 rows of data here, but you can see if we again drill in what that represents. And it happens that someone found 200 honeybees and called it in. I think this was at, so you can see exactly where it was, in which park it was in, and at what time. But this is a great way to kind of drill into your data and understand a bit more. So it looks like bees and fish are really throwing off our data a little bit, but that's okay. We can deal with that. Now we've got sort of probably the basics for scaffolding a dashboard and to start working with those bits. So like I mentioned early on, when you build a dashboard in Tableau, that's a collection of visualizations or worksheets. So we're going to go ahead and click the Make a New Dashboard button. When we get here on the left, you'll see all of the sheets that we've already made, and you can hover and see a preview of them. We've got some formatting things, some sizing to take care of as well. It defaults to this desktop browser size, but we can adjust that. For the sake of this, I'm going to make mine a bit wider so that you guys can see everything. And then there's layouts for different devices. We're going to be building this dashboard for a computer, so to either see on a laptop or a desktop. So for now, I'm going to delete this phone layout. It's a good practice, especially if you're thinking about your application, to either delete the phone layout or intentionally build one. I would also highly encourage you to stick to a structured size for your dashboard. When we build this dashboard, this is what's considered best practice, so that you know when you are laying out the different visualizations, they're going to land in the same spot and they'll be in the same position within the dashboard and on a screen when we go and review your application. And the same is true if you're just curious of learning more how to use Tableau and you're thinking about building dashboards for your current boss or for your own personal use on Tableau Public. I'd highly encourage you to stick to a structured size, and we'll kind of work through what that looks like. From this point, we can start dragging on visualizations. I'm going to drag on a couple of visualizations to start so we can start seeing how things interact with each other. So let's drag on the type of animals. Let's drag on the calls by month. Tableau will automatically bring on some important elements it thinks of. So like the color legend for the number of years, but we can just delete that and just remove it from our dashboard if we want. But in this way, we can sort of drag and drop many visualizations and put them all on a dashboard so we can start working with them together. One of the best parts about Tableau, there's lots of them, you'll learn more and more as we go along, is the interactivity that we can put in there. So we can either construct interactive filters or we can build filters on our own. I want to show you what that looks like, and then we're going to start building more directly this dashboard and kind of rounding it out. So as an example, if I click on this worksheet, this viz, you're going to see this small funnel icon that allows us to use it as a filter. So if I were to now click on marine life, we are seeing the calls by month be just associated with marine life. The same thing with birds, the same thing with non-domestic mammals. We can hold down our control key and select multiple at the same time, or we can drag with a box and select them as well. So interactivity, this sort of ad hoc filtering is really easy to set up in your dashboards. You can imagine what the difference would be if you were to build a report on your own and someone said, I want to see the calls for marine life by month. And then, no, I changed my mind, I want it to be birds, etc. So this allows you to kind of build multiple visualizations that serve the same purpose, but to interact with that data and make it more user-friendly. Okay, so we don't have a lot going on right now. When we think about building a dashboard, it's sort of like, what is the purpose of the dashboard and what questions are we trying to answer? For the sake of this one, we've got a good feel for what the data is. So we know it's calls, we know there's animals in there, we see some insight into the species and more high-level animal types that we've grouped things on. But the main dashboard that we're going to build is kind of that high-level understanding. How many calls, when were the calls happening, how many animals, when were they happening, what types of animals were there? And the last thing will be like, when were people calling or when were animals called in? Like, what is associated with that? And then we'll also kind of get fun towards the end and figure out maybe which boroughs in New York City these calls were fielded from. So that's kind of the goal with our dashboard. Depending on your style, you may want to kind of draw this out to make it look a certain way. For ease and because we're digital, I'm going to bring up what our end goal is going to look like, and this is what we're going to start working towards. So this is really what we're going to be building. I've got a couple building blocks that we started with along the way, but now we're going to get really tactical and build out these different components. So I like showing the end product because we can kind of get a sense of what we're aiming at. So I imagine this is a high-level overview dashboard. People can use this dashboard to see what type of marine life, when those calls are happening. There's our spike with our fish again, and we can see that it was a Tuesday at 9 a.m. when that occurred. There's also, let me put this in presentation mode, a nice little filter menu. So if we wanted to filter to the Bronx, we can do that as well. So now we're going to get kind of faster with Tableau. I'm sure I'm already going pretty fast, but we're going to go ahead and build out this dashboard. So again, it's important, especially if you're thinking about your application, maybe sketch in those different elements and then figure out along the way how you actually want to make a visualization to fill them in. A good best practice we've got in terms of the layout here is sort of this like high level overview at the top, and then we get a little bit more detailed at the bottom. There's also a nice feature in here where we'll toggle between if we're looking at the number of animals or the number of calls. So we're going to kind of dive in and work out those components. And we're going to kind of change some of the visualizations that we built already to kind of fit them in this format. Let's go ahead and build out that highlights table. And what we're going to do is first, we're going to build out the days of the week, the time of day, and then we're going to fill it in with that metric, and we're going to work with that metric toggle. This is where that right-click drag is so important when you're working with dates. So we're going to right-click drag onto our rows shelf or over here, either one. I tend to go up here, and we're going to choose the weekday here. We're going to choose the blue one. It's important to say when you work with discrete dates, it's kind of pulling out that piece of the date. So today is Wednesday, January 26, 2022. The weekday for today would just be Wednesday. This kind of day down here would be that exact day, 1/22/2022, but this will just pull out that component. So we'll kind of aggregate together all of the same weekdays throughout the years in a single visualization by going this path. And the same thing would be true if we were to do the month as well. So for now, just go ahead and click weekday. Again, I'm going to make this entire view. That's just going to let us spread across the entire canvas. And now let's go ahead and right-click drag onto our column shelf because we're trying to make a header now that has the time of day. So I'm going to right-click drag. And now we're going to choose the hour. So now we've got the weekday on the left running Sunday through Saturday, and then we've got our time of day. This is just that single hour. This is where it's also beneficial to think about how you're going to be communicating your data to your end users or us with your application. You can right click and format that date. You'll see right now that it just has a 7 for the hour, but let's go ahead and put it in the 12-hour format. So this is a little bit more palatable. We can see midnight to 11 p.m. All my UK colleagues are probably like, what is she doing? Because they tend to work on a 24-hour clock. But us Americans are probably much more comfortable seeing something like this. But again, you've got a lot of options here, but we'll just keep it on the 12-hour for now. Now, like I said, we want to build both the number of calls and the number of animals, and we want that to be configurable. First, let's just work with how to bring one in there. So I'm going to first drag number of animals onto color. Again, we can see our mark type changing, and I'm going to move our legend over here so we get a little bit better visibility. It's on a square mark type. We can go ahead and set it to square. I'm going to hold down my control key, and I'm going to drag this onto label again because I want the labels to be in there. So now we can see, the darker the blue, the more animals there are at a particular time. There's our fish again that we keep coming back to. This is probably the bees, but we get a good sense of how that timing works. It's kind of skewed because of the animals that we've got in those particular areas, but you get the gist of what's going on. Now, similarly, we could drag the number of calls. I'm going to drag and replace, so just right on top, and I'm going to do the same thing for the label. Here's what our number of calls looks like. So a lot more visual density. You can see a lot more darkness in many areas here because we don't have any major incidences where there were a ton of calls in a given hour. It doesn't seem like there were, 25 different people calling about a bee swarm. That didn't happen, thankfully. But ideally, we actually want to toggle between the two metrics. And again, I'll go back to sort of our final one. And this is kind of nice because there's almost two ways to think about the data, right? We've got our calls and our animals. So it might be beneficial to know when are people making calls and how many animals are spotted during those times. So now we're going to work with what's called a parameter in Tableau to be able to toggle between those two measures. So a parameter in Tableau is sort of a user input. It's a controller that we build and will allow us to change how we interact with our data, how we work with calculated fields. There's sort of 3 steps to building a parameter or working with a parameter. The first one is to make it. You can do it 2 ways. You can right click, create a parameter, or go to this drop down here and create a parameter. What this does is it'll basically build a drop down box or like an input box would be a good way to describe it, where we can then kind of control how users interact with our data. We're going to call this select metric, for lack of any better terminology. You can choose the data type in here, so all of our major data types, and then you can configure it to different values. For the sake of this, we're going to go ahead and set it as an integer, and we can allow it to be any value, but we really want to do a list. What this is going to be is we're going to have 2 options. The first one, and I'm going to enter it like this, 1 is going to be the number of calls. And you'll note that I'm doing this. This is sort of a time-saving technique, and this will speed up your calculations. If we put this as an integer and we use it as 1 in our calculated field, as opposed to having to call the number of calls, and we'll do the same thing for 2. So that will be the number of animals. And you don't have to put it in all caps. I tend to play around in all caps whenever I'm training folks. So that's a style thing that you'll see whenever you go to my Tableau public. But basically what we're building, I'm going to right click and show this parameter, is the selection box. So now we can toggle between the number of calls or the number of animals, or that's the intention. It's not actually doing anything yet because it's not connected to anything. So let's go ahead and connect it to our calculations. So to do that, we're going to build a calculated field. So let's go ahead and create a calculated field. Let's call this selected metric. And we're going to use a case statement. If you've worked in coding before, a case statement basically says, look at this particular field. So in this case, our select metric, and let me make that a bit larger. And depending on what that is, we're going to call something different. So it's almost like an if statement, but a little bit different. We're kind of saving ourselves some time. So we're going to say when that value, so the select metric parameter is 1, then we want to use the number of calls, I think, and I can just drag this in. When 2, then the number of animals, and we will end that. So again, we're just defining it. We're saying, okay, when this toggle is set to 1, it's the number of calls. When it's set to 2, we want it to show the number of animals. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now let's drag that both onto color, and let's put that onto the label as well. And let's check and make sure it's working. So right now we're on the number of animals. We can see our fish. If we switch to the number of calls, we're now getting that other heat map there, highlight table there, so you can see the toggle of that data. We're going to do one more fun thing with this and build one more calculated field. I'm actually going to right click and I'm going to duplicate this calculated field. And what we're going to do is now edit this. So when I duplicate it, it's the exact same calculation. And all we're going to do is I'm going to call this color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this negative. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of trick Tableau. If you look at it right now, we've got this gradient color that's getting darker as the frequency increases for both calls and animals. But it would be nice visually, and you saw it in kind of the end result, if we toggled what that color was. So I'm going to trick Tableau by making the number of animals negative. It's only going to be for the color, and we're going to adjust the color legend so that we can use 2 different colors along the way. So we'll go ahead and click OK, and I'm going to just drag this onto color. So if you're tracking along with me, we've got the metric on the label, and then our new calculation, our metric color on color. Now we're going to go in and we're going to edit the colors, and I'm going to choose down here the orange, blue, white diverging. So this starts at orange and it goes through white. And I'm actually going to configure this so that the center is 0. So if you're seeing what I'm doing, the trick that I'm trying to employ is for the number of animals, we're going to have the color legend show them as all negative. So they should be orange, getting darker orange as the frequency increases, and the number of calls to be blue and more frequent as there are more of those. So we'll just go ahead and center that there and click apply. Now we're on the number of calls and we've got that pretty blue color. And if we toggle to the number of animals, we've got an orange color instead. Some quick cleanup here. Let's go ahead and right click and hide the field label rows. It's kind of redundant to say it's a weekday. I think we all get that. And this is the time of day. So I think that's somewhat redundant as well. But what we can do is we can add a title to our visualization worksheet. So I'm going to double click up here and we get this cool window to do the title. You can either rename the sheet or you can come into the title. I'm going to do this inside of the title because what we can also do is we can insert that parameter. So this is our select metric, and we can say by time of day and day of week. And I'm going to click apply. So now we can see the number of animals by time of day and day of week. And if I toggle, now we have our dynamic title here. Let's go ahead and rename this, and let's just call this the highlight table for now. Okay. Now let's pop back over to our dashboard and let's start bringing more things onto the canvas. So let's bring on our highlight table. We're going to put it down here towards the bottom. I'll just leave it here for now. Let's take our metric toggle. I'm going to go ahead and float it. If you think back to what the solution looked like, or here it is, we've got this kind of drop down right next to it. So I'm just going to float it. Floating means it's kind of moving around anywhere on the canvas. Use that sparingly. Most of the time we're going to do tiled, which means we're laying it out in a precise location, but we're going to end up with this floating, so I might as well float it now. And then let's go ahead and get rid of this color legend. And I'm going to move this visualization up just for now so that we've got the beginnings of our bottom section. So we've got our number of calls, and then maybe put this over here, and we can go ahead and test and toggle between that. We might need to move it a little bit over to the right. So now we've got our highlight table that's toggling between those two options. Now let's go back to our number of animals. This is actually pretty good. I'm going to set this to entire view and then do a little bit of formatting. Let's just center align this so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. And I tend to, these are usually called fans, big angry numbers if we're saying it during the recording, or KPIs might be a good way to explain it. I typically make my KPIs such that the number is a little bit larger and then the description is beneath it. So we're just going to center this so that when we bring it on, it's nice in that format. I'm actually going to even right click and duplicate this. And now let's rename this and call it the number of calls. Let's just take this same formatting because, again, I think we're all kind of a bit lazy and want to be efficient with our time. So I've got the same layout, but now let's drag number of calls here instead and change our text to calls. So we've got the building blocks. We've got our two KPIs, our number of animals and our number of calls. And let me go ahead and bring those onto the dashboard. I'm going to do this now because it's going to help. We're going to bring on a couple containers to start working with it. Containers are just ways to kind of align your dashboard and the visual elements you have in it. So I'm going to bring on a horizontal container, and I'm going to drag the number of animals. Once I'm over the container, I'm holding down my shift key to put it in there. And I'm going to do the same thing with the number of calls. Nothing spectacular here, just putting them in the same side. So now I can move them around together. We'll start with that. Now let's take our calls by month visualization and let's go back and actually change it. So I want it to be sort of unbroken time, continuous time by month. So I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to take the year off of color. So this is an important learning moment or teaching moment. When I had the different years, you can see that they were different colors. But if I take year off, we're now aggregating together everything for January. So the takeaway is if you're working with dates and they're blue, you're working with date parts. So these are all the Januaries of all the years. But we're going to go ahead and right click and set this to our continuous month. So you can see it's sort of truncated to the month and the year. This is what we're looking for, that sort of unbroken time here that goes on. And let's also actually add in a reference line here, an average line. So on the left,
we've got our analytics pane. We've got different options for what we can bring on. We're going to drag on an average line. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to do an average by month across the entire chart. So we're going to just drag and drop it onto table. Let's do some quick formatting here. Let's go in and edit it. And let's actually make the label let's customize that, and let's just call it average. And then we can insert the value here. And we'll make this a dotted line because we're here and they look pretty. So now we have an average line. The nice thing about the average lines is they are responsive, so we can highlight and select and they will move around. I'm going to do one more small thing, which is I'm going to format this so that it is not a crazy decimal. So now we can kind of say, oh, on average, there's 54 calls a month. But if we were looking at, the last 16 months or something like that, we can see that the average is 47. So now we've got this calls by month. Let's do the same thing with our animals by month. I think this one's kind of set up pretty cleanly, so we can just take animal type off. Let's go ahead and color this orange so that it matches our highlight table that we have at the end. And let's bring on one more average line. Again, now we're working with the number of animals, and we'll do the same kind of formatting quickly, where we just customize it and put that average there. And we insert the value there. And let's make it dotted so that it matches the other one. And one more step, let's format it again so that it's an integer. I think it's gonna be really hard if people get distracted if you say that there's on average 78.52 number animals. Let's just make it 79. And the same thing happens here. So again, even though there is that sort of outlier for January, if we wanted to look at sort of like a smaller time period, we could see what that average is related to it. Heading back to our dashboard, we're now going to fill this in so that we've got those trend lines, what we call Sparklines, underneath our KPIs, our big numbers. So I'm going to do one more set of containers. This one is going to be vertical. So I'm going to stack our number of animals and our number of animals Sparkline, our trend line underneath it. So I'm actually going to grab this. I'm going to drop it over here. And then let's drag our animals by month underneath it. Again, I'm holding down my shift key. So now we've got both of these inside of a single container, and I'm now holding down my shift key again. If you don't get this right, don't worry about it. Do not get frustrated with this part. We can teach you that part. Now we've got those both inside of this nice container. So we'll do one more. We'll do the same thing for the number of calls. And I might actually just drop this in right here and put our number of calls, if I can find it again, this guy, over in that container, and then our calls by month inside it as well. I can, oh, it's already there. There it is, and drop that down here. Now I'm going to drag this whole thing and just hold down my shift key because we don't want it to float anymore. So we want it to be tiled. So now we've got these kind of 3 layers. And let's drag our last bar chart here, this which animal type. I'm going to drag it to the middle first just because it's easier. Now I'm double clicking on this container. So we've got this full blue box. Now let's go here. This is why we use containers, distribute the contents evenly. I'm sure all of you guys are like, they're all the same size. This is great. And then we can move this box over to the left. Let's do a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to hide some titles. You can do the same. You don't necessarily need them. They're kind of obvious. So we'll do a little bit of cleanup here so that we can see our KPIs. And we'll drag this down a little bit further. So we've got that. I'm going to go ahead and reset this view because it looks like I did some manual sizing. If you did the same thing, you can right click and clear the manual sizing. And let's do a little bit more cleanup. Let's go in and let's put this on color. I think that it's nice to have a little bit of color there, but we won't get too perfect for our training today. But now we've got that, and this should still interactively work with everything with our highlight table. Oh, and there goes my Tableau. It has just magically crashed, which is great because I've got the pre-baked one up. But we can click and interact with them. There's 2 other things I want to do. I probably could rebuild this quickly, but in lieu of that, let's build these last elements, which is this section right here. We've got a bar chart that has the top species. So marine life is a bit aggregated, so are birds. It's certainly helpful, but we can build what's called a vision tooltip that breaks those down a bit further. No, it's all good, guys. It auto saves. I probably could open it up, so I'm not worried at all. Let's drag on the species description. This will be our last worksheet. Let's rename this. I like to call these VIT, and we're going to call this animal detail. And then let's bring on our number of animals as a bar chart again. Bar charts are going to be your best friend.
Let's sort this again visually, and we're going to bring, we wanted this to be a top. I'm going to make it top 5. You could choose whatever number you want. I think the top 5 looks kind of nice. I'm going to hold down my control key. We're going to drag it onto the filter shelf. There's a lot of options here, but the one I want you to focus on is to click use all and select the top 5. The app does autosave. It absolutely does. And when you work online on Tableau Online, or when you work in Tableau Server, there is a lot of autosave that's built in. I've been working with Tableau so long, I remember a time before autosave was a thing. So definitely do still save early and often, but if you don't, it's okay. It will come back. So we've now filtered to the top 5 animals by number, or top 5 species descriptions by the number of animals. Let's bring on our animal type on color again. My colors have changed a little bit because I'm switching workbooks, but we'll keep going. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to add this to our tooltip. So one of the things I like about Tableau, and what I did early on, and I won't go into too much detail because I want to make sure we have time for networking, is I really like the tooltips because those are the visual explainers for the data people are seeing. So it's kind of nice to have the label, but it's really nice to clean that up and say what it represents. So we've got this, 1,223 marine life animals. So having that little bit of additional detail inside of that, just another bar chart on top of it in case someone wants to know more, is pretty cool and pretty handy. So in our tooltip, we can go ahead and insert that visualization, that vision tooltip. So if you go up here to the right and you click sheets, you can see, here's my animal detail. We'll use that one instead, and I'll delete this other one. And we'll click OK. And now we can see our bar chart. Important learning takeaway here. I lost my top 5. How Tableau works with those tops is it looks at your entire data set. So this will also be a bit advanced, but worth showing is we've got this new filter here that has the tooltip. So this is kind of interactive. As we interact, this is a filter. If I right click and I add this to context, that's going to benefit us because now we will pull the top 5 for that particular type. Basically, what we're telling Tableau is filter the data to marine life and then show me the top 5. Its default behavior is show me the top 5. So now we're kind of forcefully said, hey, can you filter to that first? Let's go in. Let's hide this field label. Let's make this the entire view. And I'm even going to turn this header off, and let's add our labels as well so that we have something a little bit prettier. And you can come in. I like to do all my formatting on the dashboard at the very end. You can come in and you can click on a worksheet. Over here, you can see tooltip. I think this is a little bit tall, so let's make it like 150 as opposed to 300, just so it looks a little bit nicer on the tooltip. It's not so dominant in terms of how they hover over. So hopefully if you're following along with me, we got most of those building blocks together. We got our KPI over here. We've got our trend of our calls by month, our animals by month, our big number, our animals by type. This is the group that we made. And then we've got our top 5 species type for each one underneath it. And we've got our cool highlight table that we can toggle between our metrics. The last step, and I'm going to delete these first and then add them back on, is filters. So let me delete these first and talk a bit about filters. So with our data, we can do 2 things. We can interactively build filters. So we have those in place where you can click and those will filter. But we can also build filter menus or filter dropdowns. That's what was in this hamburger menu. And I'm going to actually just delete that for now so that we rebuild it. But if I go into one of our visualizations, we can use the filter shelf, which will allow us to filter our data. And let's drag on burrow. So just drag that onto your filter shelf. You're going to see this menu. We're going to click all for now. So we're going to say choose all the values. We'll go ahead and click OK. If I were to right click and show the filter, we can see how that functions. So this will let us pick and choose which ones. We can actually customize this further. For now, let's just leave that on all. Eric, I will rebuild the top left so you will see exactly what that hamburger menu is. No worries. So right now we're just bringing on the burrow. We want this to filter all our data. So if you right click on it, you can choose which worksheets to apply it to. When I was taking it away, you saw me take them away, but we want this to apply to all of our data. So we're just going to click this all using this data source. So now let's see if I can show you this. If I go to the Bronx and I go to one of my other visualizations, or if we go back here, we can see everything is filtered. So that input section, that filter drop down is what we're going to bring to the entire dashboard. But now we know it's going to interact with the entire data set. And we can also bring on a date range or a date filter as well. So let's drag on our date as well. And let's choose relative date. This is kind of a nice filter menu as well, because you kind of anchor to today or now, and you can choose a time period. So let's just actually limit this to the last 24 months, as opposed to the 4 years of data that are in there. Now I can see it's going 2020 to 2021. Let's do the same thing. Again, I think it makes sense when we think about this overview dashboard that we want them to be able to filter by borough and to filter by time across everything. So we'll now apply that to all using the data source. And as a last step, let's go in. When you are on your dashboard, you can choose the viz, usually the one you generate the filter from. So we'll use our calls by month. There's a little drop down here to expose the filter. So we're going to click on, we're going to go to this filter menu. We're going to bring on borough. It already showed up on mine. Let me delete this. It showed up on mine in this container. Let me actually just delete all of this so that you can see the default behavior of it. So let me do this one more time. Filters, borough. It should happen like this, where it basically builds this dump section of the different filters. Let's bring on our second one, which is our date and time. So this guy, which has that same controller that we can configure in there. Now we're going to do the fun part, Eric, that you've been waiting for. So the first thing is we're going to click on this entire container. Again, I know it's the container because it's blue. Click this option, and we're going to click this add, show, hide button. Let me move this so it's in the white space. I'm holding down my Alt key. So if I hold that down, it hides it and has that hamburger icon. And when it's exposed, it's that X. So I'm going to first take this. I'm going to hold down my shift key and drop it to the left. You might have to get a little bit fancy because we didn't build a title. I didn't have you build one yet. And then we can take this and we can also float it. So let's move this over to the left. If it's easier for you as you're building, keep this floating. You don't have to tile it. Let's keep this container, but make it white and add a border. So it's a little bit easier to see. And now when I hold down my Alt key, I've got my hamburger menu with my filters, and they will show and hide along the way. Some finishing steps, you can customize your filter. So let's make it a multi-value dropdown to save space. And I like to add these apply buttons so that they have to pick, and then it's like, are you sure? And you're like, yeah, I'm sure. And then similarly, this date and time is a bit redundant. So let's just call it date. Okay. So now if you're tracking with me, or you're getting a close approximation of what I've built, and the final version of this will be available afterwards. If you want the exact workbook that I am showing you, you will be able to reverse engineer it with the data that we've provided today and is accessible. We've got a nice dashboard that has two things going for it. It's got this interactive element of the filters here. It's got some interactivity here. We might even want to put something like click to filter as like a subtitle or a subheader here. So now they know that if they were to click on birds, it's going to filter down to that type. And then we can do that last final toggle between the two metrics. And of course, when you're doing this, you're going to put it in presentation mode when you are presenting out to your audience members. I think we're still doing okay on time, but I wanted to make sure that we have enough time to do any sort of networking and ask any questions that you may now have, or hopefully you're seeing this and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is a job that I get to do. I get to play with data and I get to paint with numbers. That's exactly what we teach you during the data school. So I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, and we can kind of come back together, maybe answer any direct questions about what I built first, and then we can head to breakout rooms to do a little bit of networking.